Good afternoon. I'm Professor James Scott. I'm a professor here in the School of Public Health, the Dell School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. And I'd like to welcome you to the event today where we're going to be discussing a little bit about masks and mask testing. First of all, I'd really like to thank the event folks at the University of Toronto for assisting to set this up and for providing a lot of assistance. They'll be running the video, monitoring the chat today for questions and so on. So I'm really grateful to them, and I'm really happy to see so many people interested in this topic, which both me and all of my colleagues here have spent such an intense amount of effort over the last year working on. So I'm really grateful for all of your interest. So what I was hoping to do today was to give you a little bit of a tour of our laboratory where we do mask and respirator testing. Initially, we'd wanted to get a videographer and do a proper job of this, but what we ended up with was me with my my trusty iPhone doing a selfie. So it has a little bit of a feel of Blair Witch Project, but I really tried to keep things so that no one gets seasick. So hopefully that will be okay. Uh, in in the mid 2000s, so in the wake of SARS in 2004 to 2010, I got involved in looking at viral bioaerosols in relation to influenza. And part of that work, we were really interested in looking at airborne transmission of influenza. But as part of that work, we were really keen to look at the performance of masks. And at that time, I'd set up some testing capabilities to look at the effectiveness of masks, to look at how masks perform when air moves in and out of them, and so on. And we published a few papers, and that was that. But a little over a year ago, when the coronavirus pandemic really started to hit us, I think partly because of some of that work that we'd done previously in collaboration with some hospital colleagues. I guess about mid-March of last year, my phone started to ring off the hook, almost literally, with folks in hospitals wanting some support to understand how they could extend the stockpiles of masks that they had. One of the really worrying early phenomena in the coronavirus pandemic was that hospitals had limited stockpiles of N95 masks. So it was clear that that there was strong potential that they may need to reuse those masks with some decontamination. And the question, a very legitimate question, is what happens when you take masks through these sorts of decontamination processes? How does it affect the filtration efficiency of the mask? And then secondly, do these processes actually kill the coronavirus? So we got called on to assist with that, and I'm grateful to my immediate colleagues here, Professor Jeff Brook and Professor Bruce Urch, who between the three of us, within about a week's time, we were able to pull together the old equipment that I'd used in the mid-2000s to set up really what was one of the first mask testing facilities in the country. I'm really grateful that we were able to do that and to respond to the needs of the hospitals. As the pandemic went on, and supplies started to come online from different sources, the question that hospitals had for us shifted from one of what happens when we decontaminate masks to donated equipment. Is this donated equipment authentic donated equipment that meets the standards that we need in order to be able to give to healthcare workers? And fortunately, we're able to assist hospitals and other healthcare partners to ask some of those questions. And in doing so, we were able to weed out some counterfeits of equipment. So that was a very useful thing as well. So that's a brief preamble in terms of what brought us to this point. So I wanted to take a chunk of time now. I think it's about 20 minutes long to show you my DIY video. I'm going to become a TikTok star of our laboratory testing capabilities, and we have a number of things that we can do in the lab. But I've chosen to show you two of these things in a little bit more detail. So I think we'll transition now to the video. And as you watch the video, if you could kindly just type any of your questions into the chat. And then once we conclude the video, the event folks are going to try to compile some of those questions, and we'll see if we can answer them, at least to the best of my ability. So thanks, and we'll transition to the video now.
I'm James Scott. I'm a professor in the Division of Occupational and Environmental Health at the Dal Atlantis School of Public Health. Since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, my laboratory here at the University of Toronto has been engaged in mask testing, and that's with a goal to help ensure the safety and security of healthcare workers who are on the front line of managing COVID-19. And I'd like to give you a tour of the laboratory where we do that work. Before we discuss all of the testing equipment in the laboratory, I'd like first to give you a sense of what masks are and how they differ from respirators. On these two mannequins that I've placed here, you'll see that the mannequin on the right-hand side has what we'd call a mask. And this is a typical mask that might be used for surgical procedures, or it could be a non-medical mask. The thing that's characteristic about this mask is it doesn't really fit the face very well. It can have gaps on the side. It ties behind the head, or it has ear loops around it. This mask is typically used as source control. And by source control, what we mean is that it protects the people around the individual wearing it from anything that the individual may be emitting into the environment. By contrast, this person on the left-hand side is wearing a respirator. And a respirator, this is a filtering facepiece respirator, so the entire surface of this respirator is a filter, but this is fitted to the face of the user, and different users need to be fit tested for specific respirators in order to make sure that they properly function. This also secures behind the head in this case, and in this case it also has a nose strap that helps the area around the nose to better conform to the face. The importance of this difference is that the respirator on this side is additionally intended to protect the individual from exposure to agents from people in the environment. So a respirator provides both personal protection and source control. A mask only provides source control. In order to test respirators, we use a test method called the NIOSH test method, and this is an acronym that stands for the National Institutes of Occupational Safety and Health in the United States. That testing protocol is also recognized in Canada, although we've been cooperating with the Canadian Standards Association to try to write a Canadian standard that will replace it. Eventually, though, I expect that what emerges as a Canadian standard will look an awful lot like the NIOSH standard. Similarly, the Chinese standard, GB 2626, that's used to test KN95 masks, is also a lot like the N95 standard. In fact, it may actually be a little bit better than the N95 standard. By contrast, medical masks are tested against a standard called ASTM 2100. And part of that ASTM 2100 test involves a filtration efficiency test that we call ASTM 2299. I know, this is really a lot of acronyms. Health Canada recognizes ASTM 2299 as the de facto filtration standard for medical masks. For non-medical face masks, there's also a very recently released testing method that's available also from ASTM, but I won't discuss that now, although our laboratory does have the capability of conducting that test. So for the NIOSH test, we have a couple of devices in the laboratory that are able to conduct that. The first one we walked past when we came in the door, and it's this device right here in blue. This is the standard testing device used to conduct the NIOSH test. It's called a TSI 8130A. How it works is relatively simple. For masks, we attach the mask to a plate, and we do that by hot glue around the perimeter of the mask. There's a hole in the plate that allows us to draw air through the mask. That plate gets placed on a test platter, like so that the hole is aligned roughly in the center of the hole that you saw beneath. And then on top of that mask, we'll put a little chamber. And once all of that's in place, we lower this top piece so that it clamps against the upper face of the chamber. Once that's all in place, then we're able to emit an aerosol that contains very fine salt particles from this upper nozzle. A pump draws air through the mask, and we're able to measure the concentration of particles on this side of the mask and compare it to the concentration of particles on the other side of the mask. And using those two numbers, we're able to calculate the filtration efficiency of a mask. N95, which is one of the standard configurations for respirators that are used for N95 for worker protection in the case of healthcare workers and others. The N95, the 95 refers to 95% of particles that are excluded by the mask. And the particles that we use to test are very small. I said these are salt particles, but they're very, very fine salt particles. They're only about 75 nanometers in size. And the COVID-19 virus itself is about 100 nanometers in size. Here's a diagram that explains how that instrument that I just showed you works. Air from a compressor is passed through a gas dryer to ensure that there's no water in it, and then through a HEPA filter to make sure that there's no particles in it. At that point, the airstream is split into two parts. Part of the airstream is passed into a jar that contains a salt solution, and that causes salt droplets to be emitted into the air. And those salt droplets are passed through a duct into a thing called a mixing chamber. Meanwhile, the second airstream also fills the mixing chamber with air. This causes the salt droplets to evaporate, and what's left over are tiny salt particles. Those salt particles are then passed through a charge neutralizer that makes sure that there's no static charge on them, and then those are passed to the mask. In the case of this diagram, I've shown the mask attached to a mannequin head, but I just showed you the device that attaches it to a plate. I'll show you the other device that we use that does actually use a mannequin head. We draw air through the mannequin as though the mannequin is breathing in, and then we measure the concentration of salt particles in front of the mask, and we compare that to the concentration of particles on the other side of the mask. And that's what we use to calculate the filtration efficiency of the mask. So when we first started out doing mask testing, we used a homemade mask testing apparatus that looks something like this long tube. And this is the thing that's depicted more accurately in the diagram that I just showed. So here you can see air coming in through this red line from a compressor, and it's passed through a HEPA filter and divided into two air streams. One airstream is passed to a nebulizer that contains a salt solution, and the other airstream is brought into what will eventually lead to the mixing chamber. The salt droplets are then brought into the air, and that's passed into this long mixing chamber that has baffles in it. That makes sure that all of the liquid in the salt solution evaporates, and all we're left with is salt dust. And from there, the salt particles are passed through a cyclone, and this cyclone rapidly spins particles around so that the very large ones come out at the bottom, because all we're interested in are the very fine salt particles. And then those are passed through this long tube that contains a jacket of a radioactive material, and passage through this causes any electrostatic charges on the particles to be neutralized. And then from there, this salt mist, or I guess salt dry aerosol, is passed into a chamber. And for this chamber, we're using a Pelican case. And the Pelican case is great because it seals. It has a gasket around the edge of it. We can outfit it with fittings to put air in and out and do sampling. We can put fans in it to make sure that everything is mixed. And then we take the mask as it's attached to the aluminum coupon that I showed you, place it in here, and then attach to the back of that a hose that draws air through the mask. And then we're able to, through this sampling port, measure the concentration of particles in the air in the chamber. And through a second sampling port attached on the back of the tube that pulls air through the mask, we're also able to measure the particles. In this case, we measure those particles with a device that's located all the way at the end of this bench called a scanning mobility particle sizer. This scanning mobility particle sizer consists of really two instruments. The first instrument is called a differential mobility analyzer, and the second is called a condensation particle counter. The differential mobility analyzer basically consists of a pump and a computer, and then a long tube through which air is passed. The air is in a cylinder, and down the center of the cylinder is a charged rod. The charged rod changes voltage as air is passed through it, and then a tiny little hole allows air to be pulled off the tube. What this effectively does is it draws particles close to the rod according to their size. So as the charge on the rod changes, it allows different size particles to be emitted through this tube. And those particles are moved over to this condensation particle counter that counts the number of particles in the air for each one of those size fractions. This device combines all of those two instruments in one. It's also a scanning mobility particle sizer. And here you can see just the distribution of particles that are present in the air, and right now it's just sampling general lab air. So this instrument, both of these instruments actually, are able to count particles all the way down to 10 nanometers up to about 1 micron in diameter. And 1 micron is about 10 times the size of the SARS coronavirus 2. So this is fine for testing masks that can be glued down to a plate. But what about more sophisticated masks? Say those that have a silicone facepiece or that actually need to be attached to something that more closely resembles a head. Well, I showed you those mannequin heads at the beginning, and that's actually what we use those for. We have a large stainless steel chamber, and we can substitute that large stainless steel chamber for the Pelican case that I just showed you and use it to test different kinds of masks. So for instance, masks that are used for firefighters or other emergency responders that fit the full face, and so on. Now, showing you this next device is going to present a bit of a challenge because space is really tight in this laboratory, and this is not a very convenient setup, but it's really what we have to work with. So I'll give it a try. So here, located on this high bench, is our ASTM 2299 test apparatus. It works a lot like the test apparatuses that I just showed you, in the sense that air comes in from a compressor and it's passed through a HEPA filter, and that HEPA filter then feeds air either into a nebulizer or into a duct. The nebulizer in this case has been removed, but if I move around you can see where it was left hanging. So this is the jar top of the nebulizer. So the same idea, except this nebulizer doesn't use salt. This nebulizer is filled with a suspension of polystyrene latex microspheres that are 100 nanometers in diameter, which is exactly the same size as the SARS coronavirus 2. So those tiny, tiny plastic beads are brought into the airstream in this duct, and then they're passed along into another larger duct that contains baffles. And the intention of that is to make sure that all of the liquid that's present in those droplets evaporates, and all we're left with are those tiny little plastic beads. So those tiny plastic beads in the air are then brought into another duct, and this duct is oriented vertically. In our earlier experiments, we were using a very large air velocity, which meant that we could keep the entire instrument horizontal, and gravity didn't really have much of an effect on the particles. We've recently been doing tests at lower velocity, and it's important at lower velocity that the particles are moving in the same direction as the gravitational vector. So those latex beads suspended in the air move down through this duct, and then here is a gap in the duct where we position our test object. And normally what we do is we snip a tiny piece out from the center of a mask. Remember, this is a device that's used for testing medical masks or also non-medical masks. And then we place that over top of the the hole in the duct, and then the device moves in and we attach it and pin it together so that air doesn't leak out. And then the same idea. We have an air tap here and an air tap further down where we can take samples to measure the upstream and downstream concentration of those very fine particles as air moves through the mask. And similarly, this test can be analyzed using an SMPS, although for this test, because we're only looking at 100 nanometer particles, all we need to look at is the 100 nanometer channel that comes off the SMPS. This diagram summarizes what I just described, and you'll see that it looks an awful lot like the diagram that I showed you earlier with the NIOSH test. Air comes in, is divided, goes through a nebulizer. Droplets containing particles are mixed in an airstream in a mixing chamber, goes through a charge neutralizer, goes into this long duct where the test coupon is placed. Particles are measured upstream and compared to particles downstream and analyzed with an SMPS. There's a third device that we use, although I'm not going to show that because we've actually scavenged some of the parts for it in order to test graphene particle shedding from other types of masks, but I'll describe it. This mask tests bacterial filtration efficiency, and bacterial filtration efficiency is a test that's commonly done with medical grade masks. It takes an aerosol that contains bacterial cells and it moves them through a mask, measuring the concentration of bacterial cells in front of the mask and comparing that to the concentration of bacterial cells that get through the mask. And this is fairly commonly done, and it's one of the tests that Health Canada requires for the certification of medical masks. We do it here in another biohazard containment laboratory, which I could take you in, but as I said, much of that apparatus has been disassembled so that we can look at graphene particle shedding for another experiment. And we can discuss that in the round following this video. Most of our mask testing activities early on in the pandemic were driven by hospital needs for masks. And as you probably know, very early on in the pandemic, many hospitals were close to running out of masks. And they got to the point where they needed to find ways to sterilize and reuse masks. But one of the big questions was, what do these kinds of processes do to the filtration efficiency of the masks? So we assisted a number of hospitals in the Greater Toronto area and elsewhere to look at exactly that question so that they could validate their mask reuse protocols in the event that they needed them. Since then, many of our efforts have shifted to looking at other kinds of questions. Unfortunately, as the pandemic has gone on and shortages of respiratory protective equipment have continued, a number of other types of masks have increasingly penetrated the market, and many of these turn out to be counterfeit masks. So in the case of hospitals receiving donated materials, it's really incumbent on hospitals to make sure that those materials satisfy the requirements for respiratory protective equipment and meet the needs to be able to protect hospital workers. So we've been able to assist a number of hospitals also with screening donations and making sure that the materials that they have in hand are actually able to be used by healthcare workers. In a lot of this work, we've found striking numbers of counterfeits in these kinds of materials. Probably about a third of N95 masks that we've found have been counterfeit, and roughly a quarter of N95 masks we've found have been counterfeit. So this is a very serious problem, and it's one that others have encountered also elsewhere in Canada as well as the United States. But we're very pleased that we've been able to help with this effort, both in looking at mask reuse protocols and as well in screening out potential counterfeits for our partners in healthcare.
And that's it. So I'll entertain any questions that people have in relation to that video, or anything as far as questions that they might have more generally about masks or respirators. Do we have anything?
If I leave my N95 respirator in a loose paper bag for about 4 to 5 days. or can I leave?
Just in terms of inactivating the SARS coronavirus 2, sure. So it seems like the SARS coronavirus 2 is more durable on surfaces that are non-porous surfaces. So say on a stainless steel surface or a plastic surface, the virus lasts much longer than it does on a fibrous surface, which was a bit of a surprise to a lot of us at the outset. And many people left their Amazon packages on their doorsteps for too long and had them stolen, trying to get them decontaminated just by sunlight. But it does seem like the SARS coronavirus 2 doesn't live for very long on fibrous surfaces. So you're probably good with less time than that. Maybe even a day is going to be enough. The one thing that may be an issue, though, is that you don't necessarily want to share masks because, well, first of all, it's kind of gross. But secondly, there are other things that may end up on the masks, like bacteria, Staph aureus, for example, that may actually be much longer lived than the SARS coronavirus 2, and sunlight may not be as effective a disinfectant for those, sunlight or just time. But for the SARS coronavirus 2, for sure, on groceries, in bags that are fibrous bags like paper bags, boxes that are cardboard boxes, all sorts of things like that, the virus does seem to be fairly short-lived.
Next question. How do medical mask standards differ between countries across the world? How does Canada compare?
It's a really good question. I'm only really familiar with the standards in the EU, and the standards in the EU really look a lot similar to what we have. Basically, globally, I think there's a fair amount of standardization in these. Even if I've looked at the standard testing methods, either for medical masks or for respirators in different jurisdictions, they tend to all be very similar. And part of that, I think, is that supply chains for many of these materials have basically been global supply chains. So in order to be able to market masks in multiple jurisdictions, it's been important to really, as much as possible, align some of these standard methods. So as I say, the only for medical masks, the only standards that I have much familiarity with are the European ones, and they're really similar to the North American standards.
Next question. Do you also test how masks perform in less than ideal conditions, like when a mask becomes moist?
That's a really good question. We've done a little bit of work in that kind of testing. One of the things that I've been very interested in understanding better is how masks that don't have very good fits perform. Say a mask that might be a non-medical mask that has gaps, or even a medical face mask that has gaps. Can we say anything about the nature of that leakage condition and how much that reduces the effectiveness of the mask? So we've done a little bit of investigations on that kind of question, also on double masks and how that may change the leakage condition around a poorly fitting mask. So we've done a little bit of looking at some of those kinds of questions, but not really enough to say much generally. Colleagues at the National Research Council in Ottawa, who haven't maybe been quite as bogged down with routine kind of testing as we have done a little bit more research on that. And they've really done experiments where they've engineered leakage. So they've taken essentially hole punches of different sizes and punched little holes in masks. So they know exactly how big the hole is. And from that, they can calculate how much air leaks through that hole and see, at what point when you have a mask leaking, does the effectiveness of the mask really drop off? And from some of their work, it seems like you can have a bit of leakage from a mask and still have reasonable filtration efficiency of that mask, but it still remains kind of an open question, and it's one that we would like to look at a little bit more closely. But it's just we've really been inundated over the last year with hospital testing. One of the big challenges is that the commercial sector to do this kind of testing typically charges about $400 a test. And if you're a hospital and you need to validate your potential mask reuse protocol, or you need to screen a bunch of donations, that could mean a bill for commercial service costs up to about $40,000. And hospitals just don't have the access to be able to pay those kinds of fees. So our role in this really has been to offer, for the most part, pro bono or massively discounted testing to folks who just aren't able to pay the commercial sector to do that sort of testing. So back to your question, the unfortunate side is that that's taken us out of some of the things that I think are really exciting research questions. But hopefully as things settle down, which they seem to be, we'll be able to get back to some of those.
Next question, what is the best mask to use for the regular population?
That's a really excellent question. And my response to that standardly has been one that fits. So for the general population, if you have a mask that fits your face really well, regardless of what its filtration efficiency is, regardless of whether it's an N95, a KN95, a medical mask, a non-medical mask, whatever it is, that's the best mask for you to wear, because the general population is best protected when everyone is wearing a mask, which limits the ability of aerosols to be generated that can move greater distances and cause exposures. So source control is really, really the key thing. And in terms of source control, the most important thing is that the mask fits your face. Secondarily, if it has good filtration efficiency, it can additionally protect you a little bit. But if everyone is wearing some kind of mask and it fits reasonably well, then that's the best protection that we can have.
Next question, how can the general population tell when a mask is counterfeit?
You can't really. We've tried a little bit of this in the lab. You know, we've had a bunch of different types of masks. We'll take a look at them and kind of say, well, I don't know about that one, you know, any bets on it, whatever. And then you get it on the testing device, and there are things that we've looked at and thought, you know, these are fairly flimsy masks. I can't imagine that they'd have really good efficiency, and they've turned out to have excellent efficiency. And then other masks that we've seen have looked good, and they just haven't tested out very well. So there turns out, unfortunately, to really be no substitute for taking the mask or a sample of a particular kind of mask and getting it on the apparatus and testing it. It's unfortunate because we were hopeful at the beginning that we might be able to, as we tested masks, to be able to come up with some generalities that we could give people, particularly healthcare workers, that would help them to, in absence of doing testing, make some decisions. But so far we haven't found anything like that.
Next question, would you recommend double masking in hotspot neighborhoods?
It's a good question. Double masking really only works well as for giving you a little bit of personal protection in addition to the source control, if the mask fits your face very well. If you have a mask that's got a bit of a leakage condition around the perimeter of it, if you add more filter to the central part of the mask, which is what double masking typically does, it can actually worsen that leakage condition around the mask perimeter. So double masking really only gives you an advantage if the mask that's underneath, that's right in contact with your face, fits really well. And if it doesn't, then it actually could potentially increase your risk.
Next question, who built the testing device in your lab? It looks like a plumber and a carpenter would needed to build it.
Yeah, so I didn't show you our very, very early prototype, which has been cannibalized for some of the other devices. But we've got an engineer machinist that we work with who's retired from the machine shop in chemical engineering, and he lives up northwest of the city on a farm surrounded by dairy farms, and he still does a lot of stuff. He's got a little machine shop and does some work, and he's a very practical guy and has a really good understanding of physics and instruments and that kind of thing. So we've used him. We've been really fortunate to have him and access to him, because he's helped us with design decisions and trying to figure out ways that we can do something well but inexpensively. So he's been responsible for coming up with a lot of these basic designs and pulling together the plumbing parts and that kind of thing. But as I say, these have been very much living devices, in the sense that as we've worked with them and our needs have changed a little bit, or we've had a little bit of experience with how the performance works, then we've tweaked things, we've added things, we've removed things. They're kind of a state of flux, but yeah, that's how we've done it. So it's really been an all hands on deck standpoint, and it's fortunate that that my team here is very much interested in mechanically how things work. So we've been able to do a lot of this troubleshooting ourselves, but we're fortunate also to have access to our machinist colleague.
Next question. Are there any guidelines regarding how long a N or KN95 mask can be worn at one time before they need to be replaced?
Not as far as I know. And it does seem like there's deterioration over time. With some of the mask reuse work that we've done, at least the filtration efficiency of some types of masks tends to be fairly durable, and the mask could be reused multiple times, maybe 6 times, a dozen times at least, without much compromise in the filtration efficiency. My sense of that is that these are fairly N95 and KN95 masks anywhere. They're quite engineered devices, and they're fairly fragile devices. So if the handling is very gentle, then they'll probably last a lot longer. If the handling is kind of rough, then they may not last very long at all. So I'm sorry, I can't really give you much guidance on that, except to say that that you can certainly use them more than once without much in the way of change.
Next question. Can you comment on the aerosol streams that drift behind runners and bikers, such as the research out of Belgium and the Netherlands? Does this suggest we should wear masks while walking and hiking?
I think probably not, because in the outdoor environment, there are 3 things that are really on our side that prevent this virus from spreading in the air, even though it may be emitted into the air. The first is that in the outdoor environment, there's a massive amount of dilution air. So air is mixing. There may be these streams in certain kinds of circumstances, but there's an awful lot of air that's effectively dilution air. So that can take something that may even be a strong emission and fairly rapidly reduce it to one that's much less strong. The second is sunlight, and we know, or at least suspect, that the UV exposure of droplet nuclei that contain virions of the SARS coronavirus 2 are pretty susceptible to kill by UV. And then the third is that in outdoor air, a very common ground level pollutant is ozone. We think of ozone as being the gas that's in the high atmosphere, the upper atmosphere, that shields us down below from UV light. But there's also a fair amount of ozone that exists at ground level, and it's the smell, it's the gas that's responsible for the smell, the fresh air smell that we smell after thunderstorms. Ozone reacts chemically with the lipids that are in the exterior envelope of this virus, as well as other lipid envelope viruses, and it really rapidly denatures those lipid envelopes and kills the virus. So those 3 things together mean that outdoor air inherently is much safer than the indoor environment.
Question. I sometimes work in the operating room of a hospital and occasionally see other healthcare professionals wearing medical masks over their N95s in the middle of operations. Is there any benefit to this regarding filtration or efficiency, or would it be largely be for aesthetic purposes?
Well, there are 2 benefits that I can think of immediately. The first is that wearing a surgical mask over top of an N95 that's a properly fit tested N95 on a healthcare worker can actually help to improve the seal, the perimeter seal of the mask, because it will be another force that's pulling that mask against your face. But that's probably less important than the other reason that I can think of, and that is protecting the exterior surface of that N95 mask in the event that there's any kind of liquid emission or smoke emission or whatever during the medical procedure that might protect the underlying N95 so that it could be reused later on with decontamination or however that needs to happen. So I think those two reasons may mean that it's useful in that as a circumstance to wear a medical mask over top of an N95. In general, though, I don't know that it really confers much benefit as far as filtration.
Next question, are N95 and KN95 masks essentially equivalent?
In theory, they should be equivalent. The testing methodology that's used to validate the design of N95 masks and the design of KN95 masks, those testing methodologies are almost identical. The only major difference is that the KN95 test, prior to testing the mask design, it has a number of conditioning steps. It requires you to hold the mask at very high temperature for a period of time, and then at very low temperature for a period of time, and then at very high humidity for a period of time. And that can be very stressful to the fibers in the mask. So, and then once that conditioning is completed, then you test the mask. Whereas the NIOSH N95 testing protocol only has a humidity and sort of moderate temperature incubation. So it doesn't have that very low temperature preconditioning step. But other than that, those testing methodologies are almost identical. That's why I said that the KN95 testing methodology is a little bit more stringent. The thing, though, that we found is that there are a number of masks that claim to be tested. Their design claims to be tested to one of those two methodologies, but they were probably never tested at all. It's just false marketing and a counterfeit claim. And that's really the concern. And we found that, as I said, both with N95 masks as well as KN95 masks. So it's a challenge.
Next question, in your testing, were any of the used masks able to be used again after you sterilized them?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So very initially, when I'd say for the first 3 months of our involvement with the academic hospitals here in the Toronto area, I think there might have been 1 or 2 hospitals that needed to move forward with reuse of masks. But to be extra cautious, we advised and it was decided that those would be that initially the healthcare worker would put a tag or a label on the mask, and that once that mask had gone through a decontamination process, it would be returned to the same healthcare worker, so that there was no risk of potentially inactivating the SARS coronavirus 2, but leaving something else behind that could then be moved on to someone else who used that mask. So we did avoid that, but then once more stock came online, it became possible to not really have to worry about that so much. So we're happy about that. I don't know if that answers the question.
Next question, how is the particle slicer calibrated in your lab? It sounds like the voltage in that tube selects the particle size, but how do you know which voltage is required for each size?
Yeah, so it does this automatically, and the size categories are not defined by physical size of particles. They're defined by what's called electrostatic size of particles. That is, the larger particle has more momentum as it's traveling in the air, so it takes a little bit more voltage to pull it towards the rod. Smaller particles have less momentum, so they're very easily pulled towards the rod. And then as the voltage of the rod changes, the little outlet that's located at a very strategic point in that differential mobility analyzer lets out just one narrow size band of electrostatic particle size. So that's calibrated against things that we know their physical diameter. And the bulk of the calibration of the instrument is done by the manufacturer. We've got a couple of local sources. The manufacturer is in the United States. There are a couple of local sources to be able to calibrate those things. But we also can, to some extent, do some in-house calibration because the polystyrene latex microspheres that we use are NIST traceable. NIST is a standards organization in the United States that also is recognized in Canada, and they make and different manufacturers produce particles of known size where we know exactly what the variability is, and we can feed those to the instrument either as a mixture or separately, and we can use that to calibrate what the instrument tells us the electrostatic size of the particles is. So that's really how we do that. And when we've done that and done cross checks even between instruments and that sort of thing, we found that there's very, very little drift. Like these are quite robust instruments.
Next question. What is your view on homemade cloth masks?
I think they're really effective source control. We've seen, regardless of what they're made of or how they're made, as long as they fit the face very well. We've seen a number of homemade DIY masks that have actually performed really well. They've performed almost as well as N95 masks, just in terms of the filtration efficiency. And then we've seen a whole bunch that have not really performed very well. But from the standpoint of source control, I think they're all basically very good. Because if you think about it, when you breathe out, droplets come out of your nose and mouth, and these are very fine droplets. Partly the medical community has overclassified droplets because droplets don't exist for very long once they're emitted into the air. So a droplet that might be 1 micron in diameter, so 1/1000th of a millimeter in diameter, as soon as it's emitted into the air, even if the relative humidity is fairly high, the water in that droplet starts to evaporate. And within about 300 milliseconds, all of the water is gone. So it's not a droplet anymore. It's the aggregated mass of particles that can't evaporate in that droplet. It's a thing that we call a droplet nucleus, or a dust particle that can move on in the air. So if you think about the fabric of that non-medical mask and how close it is to your nose and mouth, it's able to stop those particles while they're still droplets, literally liquid droplets. And as soon as that liquid droplet impacts or impinges on the fibers in that mask, then that droplet is not able to evaporate and lose its water and become a fine dust particle that moves along. So that's why these non-medical masks and other types of masks are really, really effective source control for this virus.
Next question. How do other viruses compare in particle size to COVID-19?
There's a range, but I'd say the smallest virus that I can think of is maybe a 30 nanometer virus, so which is about a third the size of the SARS coronavirus 2. And there are some viruses that are really large viruses, like pox viruses and things, but all of those would be under 1 micron in size. So viruses tend to exist in what I call the nanoscale. So we measure them in nanometers. A lot of my career has been spent looking at things in the microscale that we measure in micrometers. So it's been a bit of a challenge for me to sort of adjust my thinking from the microscale down to the nanoscale, because lots of different things happen. Things that are important physical principles at the microscale don't matter at the nanoscale, like mass and inertia and things like that. But things at the nanoscale that are really important are things like electrical charge or just diffusion. So I'd say that the SARS coronavirus 2 is probably on the lower side of typical virus particle sizes. But then if you think about the virus and how it moves around in the air, the virus is always emitted in a droplet of some form. And then that droplet, as I said, it either splats into something before it can evaporate, or it goes on to evaporate. But it's almost never going to happen that one droplet contains only one virus particle, and that droplet evaporates, leaving only a droplet nucleus that contains one virus particle. There will always be more. It'll be like gumballs in a gumball machine. And as that droplet evaporates, it draws together all of those virus particles into a little droplet nucleus that may contain 2, 3, 10, 20, 30, 50, 1,000 virus particles. So as the virus moves around in air, it is always going to be bigger than the physical size of the virus as we would measure it under an electron microscope.
Next question, how does facial hair affect protection?
Thank you for that question. It probably makes it a lot worse. You know, those of us who have occasional facial hair, I prune this back sometimes, and I think, you know, I should be setting a better example and be clean shaven. To properly use a fit-tested N95 respirator, one needs to be clean shaven. Otherwise, it's just not possible to establish a face seal if there's any amount of facial hair. So from the standpoint of source control, though, I think it matters a little bit less. I may actually have, if I'm emitting virus, maybe some of those droplets are adhering to the facial hair. I don't know. A colleague of mine once observed to me that he was on an airplane once, and when he announced to the person sitting next to him that he was a microbiologist, they looked at him scandalously and said, "But you have a beard. How can that be?" So I don't know. Maybe we need to rethink the facial hair thing.
Next question. Did you publish the names of the counterfeit masks and where they came from?
We didn't, but the Centers for Disease Control in the United States has got a long list of fraudulent N95 masks, and it's useful to check that out. And some of these masks, at least the last I'd looked, are still available in big box stores. I think Health Canada also has a list that has counterfeit N95 and KN95 masks as well somewhere. I'm not completely sure of that, so don't quote me on it. But there are some of these lists available, so it's useful if you're thinking about buying a carton of masks. Take the name of the mask and type it into a Google search engine with the word counterfeit in quotation marks and just see if anything comes up.
Next question. I purchased a reusable mask that claims to be KN95 equivalent with an internal filter layer, and it remains so if very gently washed or boiled. Have you looked at masks like that?
We've looked at some like that, and I was a little uncertain about whether something like that could work, but we've found some masks like that actually do seem to function all right. So I think it's possible.
Last question. What is the most important advancement in mask technology that you have seen?
It's hard to say. I think the most important advancement from my own perspective isn't a technological advancement. It's an advancement in how we think about masks. At the very, very beginning of this pandemic, my training in occupational environmental health and how I think about masks, I think fundamentally of masks as personal protective devices. And many of us have thought about masks as personal protective devices. So when people have said, well, you know, I need an N95 to protect myself, my thinking is, well, that's not going to be useful to protect you unless you can fit test that respirator. And fit testing is a very specific procedure. You need to put that face piece on your face. You need to attach it to an instrument that measures and counts particles on the breathing side of that mask to make sure that the fit is appropriate, and then you learn how the fit feels and this sort of thing. So unless you do that from a respirator protective standpoint, we don't think of it as being a respirator that's validly used. In fact, the Occupational Health and Safety Act in Ontario specifies in certain circumstances the need for respiratory protective programs, and there's a CSA standard, Z94.4, that describes exactly what a respirator protective program is, and it requires fit testing in order for respirators to be used and function. The thing that I think is the greatest advancement here is that those of us who do that kind of thing and who have been locked into that modality of respirators have never really thought much about the use of masks as source control. And that is not protecting the person who's wearing the mask, but protecting everyone else from the person who's wearing the mask. And that, I think, is really transformative in terms of my thinking about this. So I think even if you have a mask that doesn't necessarily have a great filtration efficiency, it can still be a very, very effective source control. And if we all wear that mask as source control, then it greatly, greatly reduces the potential for this virus to transmit, and it greatly reduces the need to have personal protective equipment. So that's the thing that I think is most transformative from my perspective about masks. Nothing else?
Last question again. What research do you see needing more investment in the years to come in a post-pandemic world?
Sure, that's a really good question. So I think from the standpoint of masks, I think it would be tremendously useful if we could understand a little bit more how masks as source control function. We've really just been studying that mostly from an epidemiologic standpoint, which is really just using humans as the bioassay for who gets sick and who doesn't get sick. From my perspective, that's not really a good idea on how to do that. I think it's actually really useful if we can understand from first principles how that works and how it functions. And then we may be able to design masks better, thinking about them as being useful for source control. So that's one thing that I think is useful. Another thing that's useful is we have a number of technologies now that could be used to improve filtration efficiency of masks. There's potential for nanotechnology to be used in these situations. There can be downsides to that technology as well, because we know that there may be health issues related to exposure to nanoparticles, but there's still, I think, huge potential to use nanomaterials from the standpoint of engineering better masks and better filters. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity there to do new research, to be able to design things that can be reused, where we really know very well how they perform and what can be expected of them. So I think for me, this whole past year has been a great learning experience, and it's actually made me really enthusiastic to now proceed with some of these questions that they're very interesting research questions, but maybe 2 years ago, no one would have been interested in these research questions, but suddenly they're really topical and they're meaningful. Listen, we're not going to be rid of this coronavirus. We will go back to normal, but this coronavirus we know is going to be stuck with us as an endemic virus for a period of time. And we've learned over the last year that as we've been wearing masks and as we've been taking precautions for this coronavirus, that it's actually protected us against other things like seasonal flu, rhinoviruses, and things like that. So I think our westernized population has started to normalize the wearing of masks and the use of masks in a way that populations elsewhere in the world have known for a long time. And I think there are lots of research opportunities that are likely to emerge from that. Okay, well, again, on behalf of the Dalhousie School of Public Health and the University of Toronto, I would like to extend a great thanks to all of you for taking some time out of your day for a little Zoom conference to listen to some of the work that we've been doing in relation to masks. I'm really pleased that we had such a great turnout and that we can share some of this information with you. I'm also really grateful to the support that I had in pulling this event together, to the DLSPH Advancement Group and to the alumni engagement folks, as well as to the event coordination folks centrally within the university. It's great. Please be aware that the video of today's event will be posted on the DLSPH website in case you want to refer to it later on. And I saw that the subtitles came on at some point. They weren't always correct, but they get the point across, so those will be available as well. Please do stay in touch with us at the Dalhousie School of Public Health, both on the Public Health Sciences side and the Institute for Health Policy Management and Evaluation side. On Twitter, please follow our Facebook and Instagram as well, and we hope to see you in the near future. Thanks very much.